start a video, this wasn't just a war of trenches and artillery. It wasn't just fought with bayonets and barbed wire. World War I was also a financial war. One fought with gold reserves, in bond markets, in central banks, and in the secret offices of financiers who never set foot on the battlefield. The soldiers paid in blood, but the bankers and governments, they were calculating balance sheets. And what they did in those years not only determined who won and who lost, but it also rewired the global financial system in ways that are still impacting you today. If you think war is just about politics and armies, think again. The First World War proved that money is a weapon and one of the deadliest ever invented. In 1914, Europe was a powder keg. National rivalries, colonial ambitions, and military alliances had turned the continent into a chessboard of paranoia. But beneath all the speeches about honor and empire, there was a financial reality. War on this scale was impossible to fight without unimaginable sums of money. And here's the brutal truth. When leaders chose war, they were also choosing debt. Every empire marching its troops to the front line was also marching its people into a future of economic burden. Yet at the start, most governments believed it would be quick, over by Christmas. They thought they could pay for it the old-fashioned way, with gold, limited borrowing, and patriotic donations. Within weeks, that illusion collapsed. The war was burning money faster than anyone could imagine. Let's be precise. In the summer of 1914, Europe's financial system revolved around the gold standard. Nations promised their paper money could be exchanged for actual gold. This gave currencies credibility, but it also tied the hands of governments. Gold reserves were finite. You couldn't just print endlessly without losing the trust of your people and your creditors. Britain, France, and Germany all had respectable reserves, but once millions of men were mobilized and industry was redirected to weapons, the costs skyrocketed. Germany alone was spending over 10 million marks a day by late 1914. Britain's war costs would soon reach £2.5 million every single day. The math was merciless. The gold would not last. So, the governments suspended the rules. One by one, the major powers abandoned the gold standard, quietly admitting that money was now essentially a promise, backed by nothing more than faith in the state. And that moment, the breaking of the gold anchor, was one of the most important financial shifts in modern history. It showed how fragile the so-called real wealth of nations actually was. Money and power were now unshackled from metal, driven by printing presses, credit, and persuasion. And once governments tasted that freedom, they never went back. The financial war now began in earnest. For Germany, isolated from global capital markets and blockaded by the Royal Navy, the only option was domestic borrowing. Berlin launched massive bond drives, appealing to patriotism, urging ordinary citizens to pour their savings into war loans. The propaganda was relentless. Posters of heroic soldiers, families urged to sacrifice luxuries for the fatherland, and constant promises that investors would be repaid after victory. In total, Germany raised over 100 billion marks this way, but it was a pyramid built on hope. When defeat came, those bonds were worthless. Millions of Germans saw their life savings wiped out. That bitterness became fertile ground for extremism in the decades ahead. Economic history always leaves scars. Britain, by contrast, had one immense advantage. The City of London was the financial hub of the world. Sterling was trusted, and British networks reached across the globe. At first, the government leaned on short-term borrowing and patriotic appeals, but Betty Sonnet tapped into the deeper pools of global credit. Crucially, it turned to the United States. In 1914, America was officially neutral, but its bankers smelled opportunity. Firms like J.P. Morgan and Co. became the financial lifeline of Britain and France, arranging vast loans and managing purchases of weapons, food, and raw materials. By 1917, when America itself entered the war, Wall Street had already been bankrolling the Allied cause for years. This was not charity. This was power. American bankers earned millions in fees, and the United States emerged from the war transformed from a debtor to a creditor, from a financial follower to a global leader. If you wonder how the 20th century became the American century, this is where it began. Not on the battlefields, but in the ledgers. France faced its own dilemmas, already weakened by the costs of building its defenses and scarred by the memory of the Franco-Prussian War. It relied heavily on loans, both domestic and international. French citizens, long known as eager savers, were persuaded to buy government bonds, but much of the deeper funding, again, came from across the Atlantic. France, like Britain, became increasingly dependent on American capital. This dependency would shape politics after the war, when debts loomed and repayment became a source of tension. Meanwhile, Russia's financial war was a disaster. The empire was vast, but underdeveloped. Its banking system was fragile, and its gold reserves, while impressive on paper, were insufficient. To fund its war effort, Russia borrowed heavily from its allies, particularly France. But as defeats piled up and inflation soared, faith in the ruble collapsed. By 1917, the Russian economy was in ruins. The political system went with it. The collapse of the Tsarist regime wasn't just about ideology or bad generals. It was about a financial system stretched past its breaking point. Economic mistakes, monetary chaos, and inflation helped fuel a revolution. The scale of the financial mistakes was staggering. By the end of the war, the Allied powers had spent more than $140 billion, while the Central Powers had spent around $60 billion. These were sums the world had never seen before. The result wasn't just mountains of debt, but the destruction of the old financial order. The gold standard was shattered. Inflation ripped through economies. Germany would soon face hyperinflation so extreme that a loaf of bread cost billions of marks. And ordinary people, workers, savers, small investors were the ones who paid. And here's the connection that matters for you today. World War I was the moment governments learned they could finance the unimaginable by detaching money from reality. They discovered they could suspend gold, print endlessly, issue bonds to their own citizens, and then patch up the ruins later with propaganda. Sound familiar? Because that playbook has never disappeared. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the world looked like a battlefield, not just in its trenches, but in its balance sheets. The United States, a debtor nation before the war, now held the world's largest gold reserves, and was the largest creditor in history. Europe, the old heart of global finance, was drowning in debt. The war had turned Wall Street into the new financial capital of the planet. But this was not a smooth transition, because here's the trap. When wars are funded by borrowing, repayment becomes its own war. Britain and France, desperate to keep faith with their citizens who had bought war bonds, now had to squeeze money out of Germany in the form of reparations. The Treaty of Versailles demanded an astronomical sum, 132 billion gold marks. It was meant to punish and to shift the burden onto the defeated, but it was a fantasy. Germany simply could not pay. Every attempt to do so destabilized its economy further. The hyperinflation of 1923, when Germans carted wheelbarrows of worthless notes just to buy bread, was the direct consequence of a financial system pushed to the edge by impossible debts, and it planted seeds of rage that extremists would later harvest. The United States, flushed with gold and credit, faced a different challenge. What to do with its new dominance? American banks began pouring money back into Europe, lending to Germany so that Germany could pay reparations to Britain and France, who could then pay back their debts to America. It was a financial merry-go-round that looked stable on the surface but was built on circular logic. When the Great Depression hit, the entire structure collapsed. The world had never been more financially interlinked, and never more fragile. Now, think about your life today. When central banks promise that inflation is transitory, when governments expand debt ceilings year after year, when new money is conjured digitally at the stroke of a key. Remember 1914? Remember that the gold standard wasn't abandoned by accident, but by design, in a moment of desperation. The pattern of borrowing against the future, of printing to cover the present, of selling bonds with patriotic slogans, is more than a century old. The hidden financial battle behind World War I is not a relic of the past. It is the foundation of the present. The lesson is harsh, but necessary. Money, once untethered from reality, becomes a tool of manipulation. Governments will always find ways to finance crises, and they will always find ways to make you pay for it, whether through taxes, inflation, or the erosion of your savings. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it does rhyme. The financial playbook written in 1914 has been used again and again, but the outcome is always the same. Those in power protect themselves, and those without knowledge are sacrificed. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Never assume money is real just because it's printed. Never assume the system is stable just because the authorities say so. The truth is always hidden in the balance sheets. And history is the only teacher that doesn't lie. If this gave you a new perspective, hit that subscribe button. History has the answers. Thanks for watching.